By the early 1950s, it was very clear that the GP7 was mopping the floor with Alco's as well as Baldwin's road switchers. While the Alco RS3 managed to sell 1,418 units in its production run from May of 1950 to August of 1956, EMD's GP7 managed to sell 2,729 units in its much shorter production run from October of 1949 till May of 1954. While about this time Baldwin would go out of business, Alco was still in the fight and not giving it up willingly. It introduced its new model RS11 with its much improved 251 prime mover, making a whopping 50 horsepower more than the GP7 did in 1956. The unit's 4-cycle combustion and GE traction motors, one of the few electrical components that outperformed EMDs at the time, made this locomotive very capable. Unfortunately, even though Alco had by this point finally managed to tame it, the 244's infamous reputation continued to weigh down hard on Alco, making it all the more difficult to sell locomotives. Even though by this point EMD had taken out one of its competitors, Baldwin, and had an almost insurmountable lead over Alco in terms of raw sales, EMD just couldn't stand the idea of not having the biggest toy on the playground, most competitive product in the market. And so the company rolled out the 2 in its 1-2 punch against its road switcher competitors in the form of the GP9. As a restaurateur once told me, if you have a popular item on your menu, say a hamburger, and you're thinking of improving it to make it even better, you don't change the recipe and or reinvent the wheel. One should instead focus on the customer's feedback and give them more of what they want, and essentially tweak the recipe. If the customer says they want the patty to be bigger, you make it bigger. If they want the hamburger patty to be smaller, you make it smaller. You don't redesign the whole burger, but for what the customer is asking for. This is kind of the same thing EMD did with the GP9. The customers definitely wanted more beef in terms of horsepower. This, of course, was the era of the great horsepower wars between all the major locomotive manufacturers in the United States. And so EMD gave its customers more beef, if you will. EMD's new 567C prime mover, a development of the 567B from the GP7, again sticking to the policy of evolving instead of reinventing the wheel, made a whopping 1,750 horsepower, an improvement of 250 horsepower over the 567B of the GP7. Exactly like its predecessors, the 567B of the GP7, the 567C made its horsepower with 2-cycle combustion, 16 cylinders, and a roots blower. No turbocharging shenanigans here. The GP9 also got a new type traction motor in the form of the D37, although this didn't actually have any enhancements over the performance of the GP7's. Traction motors again rated 65,000 pounds starting and 40,000 continuous. The locomotive's weight was reduced to 120 tons, with its length increased to just over 56 feet. Sales of the GP9 started off strong and stayed that way, with a whopping 4,092 units built between 1954 and 1956. This is in sharp contrast to Alco's competing Alco RS11, which started production in February of 1956, but only managed to sell 431 units, when production ended in June of 1961. While one could easily make and support the claim that it was simply the end of the dieselization era, as being the reason for Alco not selling more RS11s, the infamous reputation of the 244 essentially stagnated and or prevented sales from many of the companies that had bought RS3s, essentially confining Alco to a niche in the market, where only its loyal customers stuck with it. Part of the niche that the RS11 occupied consisted of locomotives for dual service, that is to say, equipped with steam generators that could do both freight and passenger service. While the GP9 did in fact have an option for a steam generator, EMD was so heavily backlogged with orders that it could not get the passenger variant of the GP9 out in anything resembling reasonable time. This was due to the fact that the company had prioritized the standard version of the GP9 designed for freight and switching services, as the orders for this particular version of the locomotive were much more numerous than that of the passenger version, and producing a slightly different variant of the locomotive, even though slightly different, would drastically reduce and or impact EMD's efficiency and production numbers, which was something it could not afford at that time. And thus railroads like the Norfolk and Western, who were short of commuter/passenger power, who incidentally already owned a few GP9s, would turn to Alco for their needs. In the case of the Norfolk and Western, the company already owned several RS11s, so this was a bit of a no-brainer. The company simply added these steam generator engines to its roster of RS11s. The same situation was true on the New Haven Railroad, as the company's ever-increasing commuter operation needed more reliable equipment equipped with steam generators to handle these trains. And, not wanting to wait for GM's backlog to clear, the New Haven Railroad instead went to Alco for steam generator-equipped RS11s. It goes without saying that the GP9 was a highly successful locomotive for EMD, as it nearly doubled the sales of its predecessor, the GP7. That said, the locomotive, like many products, wasn't perfect. The two-cycle combustion 567 was known for being a bit of a gas guzzler. Again, this was not an issue during this period in time, as fuel prices were very low. This would, however, become an issue for railroads in later years, with fuel crises taking place, as well as rapid and drastic increases in the price per barrel of oil, as well as inflation taking place. The GP9, much like its predecessor, the GP7, was a very long-lived locomotive. The reason being is really quite simple. The 567 two-cycle combustion power plant was very easy to maintain and keep running, even if its longevity wasn't quite as long as that of the Alco power plants, which could, with proper maintenance, last several decades. Speaking of these locomotives' long lives, the GP9, much like its predecessor the GP7, would prove to be a popular choice for rebuilding. This is mainly due to the fact that there were just so many of them around. If a railroad, for example, needed a part for a locomotive, they could simply get it off of a locomotive that wasn't worthy of being restored, essentially stripping them and/or cannibalizing these engines and/or harvesting these engines for parts. This would keep the price for rebuilding and/or keeping these locomotives on the rails down. The main reason for this need to rebuild locomotives again was due to the horsepower wars occurring between the major U.S. manufacturers at the time. The behemoths these manufacturers were producing at that time could generate a whopping 3,000 plus horsepower, making them ideal for pulling long and/or fast freights at the time, would prove to be far too big and heavy for lightweight branch lines, as well as too powerful for such duties. Also, the idea of having a secondary fleet would prove appealing to the Class 1 railroads, as in addition to having a whole fleet of locomotives that could be utilized for switching as well as branch line duties on, again, the lighter rail mentioned before, these locomotives, which would be made more reliable in the process of rebuilding, could also be called upon in a pinch, such as a failed locomotive on a mainline freight and/or upswings in traffic, thus allowing the Class 1 railroads to easily deal with issues in such situations where a mainline freight would be brought to a halt by utilizing one of these said locomotives to get traffic moving again on the main line, and thus avoiding major delays for its freight traffic. And at the same time having a fleet of locomotives ready for upswings in traffic, allowing the Class 1s to avoid having to lease locomotives for temporary purposes. There were several so-called rebuilt variants of the GP9. The most basic type was known as the GP9M, where a GP9 would essentially be zero-lived, put back to its original factory specifications with a few enhancements, and maintaining its original 1,750 horsepower and traction motors. GP9s involved in this particular rebuild programs would be completely disassembled, having all of their internal components and parts rebuilt as factory specs, and having some enhancements such as enhanced car body filtering to make them more reliable, with the body in most cases retaining its high nose with no further alterations done to it, although in some cases this was chopped. With all the components rebuilt, the locomotive would then be reassembled and put back into service. Also, as mentioned in my previous GP7 video, there was the GP10 program, which saw GP9s as well as GP7s given more radical electrical and mechanical upgrades. This program having been developed by the Illinois Central and being carried out at their Paducah, Kentucky shops. The GP7s would see the most enhancements as they were brought up to GP9 horsepower levels. As for the GP9s, it was more of a straightforward rebuild, with the exception of a more aggressive air intake system and the chopped nose. Although some of the locomotives, specifically the Conrail units which Paducah, Kentucky got contracted to produce, retained their high noses. Nonetheless, this rebuild would still improve their reliability. Another rebuild program of a different sort that the GP9s would be involved with was the GP9 CAT. Essentially, as its name implies, these units would be sent to Caterpillar, where their EMD 567 would be replaced with a 4-cycle combustion 12-cylinder Caterpillar prime mover that made 1,500 horsepower. This rebuild, however, focused more on efficiency than it did total horsepower output, and took place during the 90s. The locomotives also received chopped noses and electrical upgrades. One would think that the GP7 and 9s have long since passed their useful lives. Far from it. Progress Rail, for example, has introduced a model based upon GP7 and 9 chassis called the genset locomotive, which employs several smaller generators, or gensets for short, the concept being that only the generators necessary for providing the power needed to accomplish a specific task are operating at a time, thus reducing the locomotive's emissions as well as improving its reliability. Another type GP9 rebuild being done by Progress Rails is known as the GP9-GP20 Eco. This is essentially the same model being produced by EMD, known as the GP20C Eco, utilizing a modern EMD 710 V8 power plant producing a whopping 2,000 horsepower, 250 more again than the GP9 produced its stock. Astonishingly enough, achieving this extra 250 horsepower with a roughly 20% fuel savings over a stock GP9. This is accomplished with turbocharging as well as a sophisticated electronic fuel injection system, the latter being something that was not available in the 50s when the GP9 was being produced, allowing the V8 710 to have half the cylinders of the 567 but still produce more horsepower than its predecessor, and also allowing it to achieve the previously mentioned 20% fuel savings over its predecessor, the 567. For EMD, the GP9 would prove a very effective tool in its 1-2 punch as a follow-up to the very popular GP7 model, its second and very successful attempt to enter the road switcher market. Indeed, so many of these locomotives continue to exist in one form or another today thanks to all the rebuild programs and sheer parts availability that this locomotive continues to leave its mark on the railroad industry to this day. Not bad for a 70-plus-year-old piece of railway equipment. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe as it will help me greatly. And as always, keep the metal side down.